the sound of a heavy rain hammering against glass. Somewhere on the 14th floor of a Houston penthouse, a birthday party is in full swing. Jazz, laughter, the clink of crystal glasses worth more than most people's monthly rent. And in the middle of all that noise, one man stands alone. Elijah Weston pressed both hands against the cold railing of his penthouse balcony and stared down at the Houston skyline glittering in the rain. 70 years old tonight. 70 years of clawing, building, bleeding, and believing. He could hear the party behind him, the laughter, the music, the warm hum of 200 guests eating food he paid for, drinking champagne he chose, standing in a building his name was carved into. But something made him stop before going back inside. A voice. His eldest son's voice, cutting through the glass door like a blade. The old man should have died years ago. If he goes into surgery and doesn't come out, that's God doing us a favor. Laughter followed. Not nervous laughter, not shocked laughter. Comfortable laughter. The kind that meant this wasn't a new conversation. Elijah Weston stood completely still. The rain didn't stop. The jazz didn't stop. The world didn't stop. But something inside him did. Let's go back. Not to the penthouse, not to Houston. Back to Beaumont, Texas, 1976. A 20-year-old kid named Elijah Weston showed up at a Beaumont drilling site wearing borrowed boots and a t-shirt with a hole in the shoulder. He had $47 in his pocket, a community college dropout certificate, and what his mother called a terrifying amount of stubbornness. The foreman laughed at him. Hired him anyway. 3 years later, Elijah understood oil the way a surgeon understands the human body. Not just what was there, but what could be there. He saw patterns in the geology reports other workers ignored. He calculated pressure gradients in his head during lunch breaks. By 1983, he had saved enough to buy a 12% stake in a small independent drilling company. By 1990, he owned the company. By 2001, Weston Energy Group was pulling contracts across Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. By 2010, he had diversified Weston Transport, a nationwide freight and logistics company, 3 luxury hotels in Dallas, Houston, and Atlanta, 1,000 acres of farmland in central Texas, and commercial real estate scattered across 6 states. Elijah Weston had built an empire with his bare hands, and he never forgot where his hands came from. Ask any warehouse worker at Weston Transport. He knew their names, not the managers, the workers, the forklift operators, the dispatchers, the overnight security guards. He paid Christmas bonuses out of his personal account when the board voted them down. He rebuilt the community center in his old Beaumont neighborhood twice. He funded scholarships that had sent over 300 kids to college. The man was not perfect, but he was real. And people knew the difference. Garrison Weston, the eldest son, 44 years old, broad shoulders, tailored suits, and a smile that cost a lot of money to manufacture. On paper, he ran Weston Energy's domestic operations. In reality, he ran his mouth, his credit cards, and his gambling habit. Nobody talked about the gambling habit. Garrison had dropped somewhere north of $4 million across private poker tables in Las Vegas, Monaco, and a very discreet club in downtown Dallas. His father had quietly covered 2 of those losses. He didn't know about the third $1.9 million owed to a man named Terrence Quill, who was not the kind of man you owed money to. The pressure on Garrison was immense. And pressure on the wrong kind of man doesn't build character. It builds desperation. Viola Weston, the youngest daughter, 38. Quiet in the way still water is quiet, not empty, just deep. She had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and she had spent most of her adult life being completely overlooked by everyone in that family except Elijah himself. She ran the Weston Foundation, scholarships, community programs, hospital partnerships. She had turned her father's charity arm into something real, something that actually worked. Her brother thought she was soft. Her stepmother thought she was a threat. And the board of directors thought she was irrelevant. All three of them were wrong. Rhonda Weston, the trophy wife. Elijah's third marriage 10 years ago, when Elijah was 60 and Rhonda was 32. She was stunning. She was charming. She could walk into a boardroom and make every man in it forget what they were arguing about. She had also been quietly sleeping with the family's corporate attorney, Prescott Hale, for the past 3 years. Prescott Hale, whose entire career, whose entire income, whose entire life was built on Elijah Weston's trust. And the last member of this family worth mentioning, Caden Weston, Garrison's son, 16 years old, lanky, awkward, still growing into his feet. He had his grandfather's hands, wide, strong, built for work, and absolutely none of his father's coldness. Caden loved his grandfather the way kids love people who actually see them. No agenda, no math, just love. He would matter later. Remember his name? The birthday party ended at midnight. Elijah Weston shook hands, accepted toasts, laughed at jokes he'd heard before, and kissed his wife on the cheek for the photographers. He was extraordinarily good at performing. But alone in his private study at 1 a.m., he sat in the dark with a glass of bourbon he didn't drink and thought about what he'd heard through the glass door. The old man should have died years ago. His eldest son's voice, easy, relaxed, like a man discussing the weather. Elijah was not a man who cried easily. He didn't cry that night. But something shifted in him, a tectonic thing, deep and permanent. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself with drama. It just happens. And afterward, nothing sits quite the same way it did before. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and started writing. Not a will, not a letter. A list of questions. How long has Garrison known Prescott? Where did the $800,000 go from the Louisville hotel account in March? Why did 3 board members change their proxy votes without telling me? He wrote for 2 hours. By 3 a.m., the list had 47 questions. He went to bed. He never got to answer them. 6 weeks after his birthday, Elijah Weston was standing at a podium in the grand ballroom of the Westin Atlanta Hotel, their newest property, delivering the keynote address at the company's annual stakeholder conference. 800 people in that room. Cameras from 2 business networks, local politicians, major investors. Elijah was 40 minutes into a speech about the company's expansion into renewable energy when he paused mid-sentence. He gripped the podium. A single drop of blood hit the white paper of his notes. Then another. He looked down at it, almost curious, like the blood belonged to someone else. Then his legs went. 800 people watched Elijah Weston collapse. The chaos that followed was the kind you can't choreograph. Screaming, rushing, someone knocking over a full table of glasses, a woman crying before she even knew what had happened, security pushing through a crowd that didn't know which way to move. Garrison Weston, sitting in the front row, stood up slowly. He didn't run to his father. He pulled out his phone. The diagnosis came fast, and it was not good. A cerebral hemorrhage, bleeding in the brain, severe enough to require immediate surgical intervention. The attending physicians in Atlanta were honest. The equipment they needed, the specialist required for this specific presentation, was not in Atlanta. Not in Houston, not even in the United States. There was a neurosurgical team in Zurich that had handled 3 similar cases in the past year. All 3 patients had survived. But there were complications beyond the hemorrhage. The fall from the podium had fractured orbital bones around his right eye. The surgical team in Zurich would need to perform cranial work and facial reconstruction simultaneously. He would look different when he woke up. If he woke up. Elijah Weston was flown to Zurich on a private medical charter 40 hours after collapsing in Atlanta. His wife Rhonda held his hand in the ambulance to the airport. She cried beautifully. Garrison stood at the gate and watched the plane disappear. His phone buzzed. A text from Prescott Hale. "The board meeting is set. How do you want to play it?" Garrison typed back 3 words. "While he sleeps." And now we get to the part of this story that will make you angry. I'm warning you. Because what Garrison, Rhonda, and Prescott did over the next 11 days while Elijah Weston lay unconscious in a hospital bed in Switzerland was not impulsive. It was planned. This had been planned for a long time. Prescott Hale had been quietly restructuring the corporate documents for 8 months. Garrison had been building relationships with 4 key board members, 3 of whom owed him personal favors, 1 of whom he had simply paid. Rhonda had been documenting Elijah's supposed mental decline in a private journal for 2 years, a journal she had created specifically to support a future competency challenge. Here's what you need to understand about the Weston Empire's corporate structure. It was built on trust. Elijah had designed it that way deliberately, not because he was naive, but because he believed that a business built on fear eventually collapses under its own weight. So his corporate structure had mechanisms that required very few signatures to move very large amounts of power. He had trusted the wrong people with those mechanisms. Over 11 days. Garrison presented emergency board resolutions citing Elijah's incapacitation. The board voted 5-2 to install him as acting CEO. Prescott Hale produced documents, allegedly signed by Elijah before the surgery, granting power of attorney to Garrison and Rhonda jointly. The signatures were forgeries. Good forgeries. Prescott had paid $40,000 for them. Ownership stakes began transferring. Weston Energy's primary operational accounts shifted to new controlling signatures. The Houston penthouse, Elijah's personal property, was transferred into a shell company, Garrison, controlled through 3 layers of paper. Viola Weston flew to Houston the moment she heard about the board vote. She showed up at Prescott's office with a printed copy of the corporate bylaws and a very calm expression. Prescott told her the documents were legitimate. She told him she didn't believe him. He told her she could hire a lawyer. She told him she would. 3 days later, her access to Weston Foundation accounts was frozen. Her office keycard stopped working. Her assistant, a woman named Dottie Reeves, who had worked with Viola for 9 years, called her in tears to say she'd been told not to report to work. Garrison had fired her. He had fired Dottie. He fired 43 other employees in the first week. Loyal, long-tenured people who had known Elijah personally. People who might ask questions or cause noise. He also fired Claude Bright, Elijah's personal driver of 19 years. A 61-year-old man from Beaumont who had driven Elijah since before Garrison was interesting to anyone. Claude Bright, who knew where everybody was buried, figuratively speaking, and who had more of Elijah's trust than anyone in that boardroom. They put Claude's personal items in a box and left them on the sidewalk. He stood there looking at that box for a long time. 23 days after the surgery began, the Hoffman Medical Clinic in Zurich experienced an electrical fire in its east wing. It was a real fire. It was also the worst possible timing in the history of worst possible timing, because that wing housed the long-term recovery unit, and 3 patients with complicated post-surgical situations were in critical condition when the fire suppression systems failed. 2 of those patients didn't make it. The clinic's administration reached out to family contacts for all 3 patients within hours of the tragedy. Garrison Weston received the call at 9 p.m., Houston time. The administrator on the phone was careful. She said the situation was unclear. She said records had been damaged in the fire. She said there was a body that had been identified as potentially matching Elijah Weston's records, but that DNA confirmation would take days, and that the family should prepare for you tomb. Garrison hung up before she finished. He called Prescott. Then he called Rhonda. By 11 p.m. that night, Garrison Weston had made a decision that crossed every line a human being can cross. He announced his father's death. Before confirmation, before DNA results, before they even knew for certain what had happened. He held a press conference the next morning, dark suit, red eyes, voice carefully broken, and told the world that Elijah Weston, self-made billionaire, father, husband, and titan of American industry, had passed away following complications from emergency surgery. The financial press ran it within the hour. The stock markets reacted. The condolence calls started flooding in. And somewhere in Houston, in a mansion that no longer belonged to the man it was built for, Rhonda Weston opened a bottle of champagne she had been keeping for exactly this occasion. They buried him in Houston. 350 people attended. There was a white casket, custom ordered, which seems excessive for a man whose body hadn't been confirmed, but details were not Garrison's strong suit. There were traditional hymns. There were eulogies. Garrison spoke for 11 minutes about his father's legacy and vision and courage, and delivered every word without once looking at Viola, who sat in the front row with her hands folded and her eyes dry and her jaw so tight it could cut glass. Caden sat beside his aunt and cried the entire time. Real tears. Uncontrolled. The kind of grief that doesn't know how to perform. Afterward, at the reception, a $200,000 event at the Houston Country Club, Garrison gave a toast. My father would want us to move forward, to keep building, to honor his vision. People nodded. Viola set down her glass and walked outside and stood in the parking lot alone for 20 minutes. She was the only person there who was actually grieving. And she was the only one who, in the quiet of that night, thought to herself, something is wrong. Something is deeply, terribly wrong. She couldn't explain it. She didn't have evidence. She just had the particular radar that people develop when they've been overlooked their whole lives. A sensitivity to things that don't sit right, to silences that are too deliberate, to grief that arrives too quickly and resolves too easily. She filed it away. And she waited. 347 miles from Houston, in a private recovery facility on the outskirts of Lyon, France. A man opened his eyes. He opened them slowly. The light was extraordinary, as if someone had turned up the brightness on the entire world. His face felt tight, foreign, like a mask worn so long it had started to bond to the skin beneath it. He tried to speak. The nurse, a compact, calm woman named Adele Fontaine, leaned forward and put her hand gently on his arm. Doucement, slowly. You've been unconscious for 19 days. He stared at the ceiling. His name was Elijah Weston. He was not dead. The clinic's records, partially destroyed in the fire, had misidentified a body from another patient. The DNA confirmation that Garrison hadn't waited for would have cleared it up immediately. But nobody had come looking. Nobody had sent a lawyer or a representative or even a personal assistant to verify. His family had simply decided he was dead and moved on. Adele brought him a tablet 3 days into his recovery. The news feed loaded automatically. He saw his own obituary. He saw a photograph from his funeral, white casket, hundreds of people, his son at a podium with practiced grief all over his face. Elijah Weston read his own obituary for 12 minutes without saying a single word. Then he asked Adele for a glass of water. She brought it. He drank it. And then he asked her one question. Is there anyone who has called this facility looking for me? Any calls? Any contacts from my family? She checked the records. She came back with a single sheet of paper. She placed it on the bed beside him. 0 calls, 0 inquiries, 0 contacts since the fire. Not one. He looked at that paper for a long time. And something shifted in him, that same tectonic thing, deep and permanent. Except this time, it didn't just shift. It set like concrete. 8 weeks into recovery, Elijah Weston stood in front of a full-length mirror for the first time since waking up. The man looking back at him was unfamiliar. The facial reconstruction had been extensive. The orbital fractures, combined with complications during surgery, had required significant restructuring of his cheekbones, his nose, and the area around his right eye. The surgical team had done extraordinary work. But the face in the mirror was not the face that had spent 70 years in the world. It was close. The bones of him were still there, the set of his jaw, the width of his forehead, but without the specific geography of the face people had known, without the exact map of Elijah Weston's features. He was a stranger. He stared at himself for a long time. Then he made a decision. He called the only person on earth he trusted completely. Dewey Marsh had been Elijah's childhood friend since they were 7 years old. They had grown up on the same street in Beaumont, graduated from the same school, worked on the same drilling site in their 20s. When Elijah's empire exploded, Dewey had quietly and deliberately stayed out of it, not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. "One of us needs to stay real," he had told Elijah once, "and it ain't gonna be you, rich man." Dewey still lived in Beaumont. He ran a small machine shop. He had never asked Elijah for anything. When the call came through, a French number, a voice that was slightly different but unmistakably, fundamentally familiar, Dewey Marsh sat down very slowly on the stool in his shop and pressed the phone hard against his ear. "Dewey, it's me." A long silence. "Say something only you would know." A pause. 1987, August. "We were working the Millfield site, and you dropped a wrench into the drill casing and told the foreman the wind did it, and I told him the same thing, and we both kept straight faces." Dewey Marsh let out one long, shaking breath. "Lord Almighty." "I need your help," Elijah said. "I need you to find Claude Bright, and I need both of you to come to France. Tell no one, not one soul." "What are you going to do?" A very long pause. Outside the window of the recovery room, the French countryside stretched out in the late afternoon light. Golden, quiet, impossibly beautiful. Elijah Weston thought about his white casket. He thought about Garrison's 11-minute eulogy. He thought about Rhonda's champagne. He thought about Viola sitting in the parking lot alone. He thought about Caden crying at the front of a church, grieving a man who was still alive. "I'm going home," he said. But not as Elijah Weston. Not yet. 6 months after a man's funeral. A black SUV rolls slowly through the gates of a Houston business tower that still carries his name. The driver is calm, elegant, unrecognizable. And somewhere in the building above him, his son is sitting in his chair. While Garrison Weston was redecorating the Houston penthouse and Rhonda was attending charity galas in Elijah's honor, his honor, the man they had buried was doing something they never anticipated. He was learning. Not business. He already knew business better than anyone in that family ever would. He was learning disappearance. Dewey Marsh had arrived in Lyon 17 days after the phone call, nervous, emotional, wearing a Beaumont machine shop t-shirt on an international flight, because Dewey Marsh had never owned a blazer and wasn't about to start now. He had walked into that recovery room, taken one long look at the man in the hospital bed, and sat down without a word. They had talked for 6 hours straight. Claude Bright had arrived 2 days later, quiet, observant, carrying a small leather bag and the particular dignity of a man who has absorbed a great insult and not yet decided what to do with it. When he saw Elijah, he stood in the doorway for a full 30 seconds. Then he said, "They left your stuff in a box on the sidewalk, sir." "I know." "I kept the box." Something almost like a smile crossed Elijah's new face. "Good man." The three of them, an old billionaire with a stranger's face, a machinist from Beaumont, and a fired driver with 19 years of loyalty, sat in that French recovery room and built a plan. Adele Fontaine, who had been quietly keeping Elijah's survival off every official record at the request of a very generous anonymous donor, brought them coffee and asked no questions. She had seen enough of the world to understand when a man needed to disappear before he could reappear. The identity took 3 weeks to construct properly. Edouard Diallo, a Senegalese-American investor based out of Geneva, independently wealthy, old family money, minerals, private equity, fluent in English with a slight accent. Elijah practiced until it sat naturally in his mouth. Impeccable suits, a calm that felt almost aristocratic. It wasn't a disguise in the cheap dramatic sense. It was a transformation. And Elijah Weston, who had spent 50 years reading people, rooms, and power dynamics, understood something that Garrison never would. The most effective disguise is not a wig or a false nose. It is expectation. Nobody looks carefully at the face of someone they've already buried. Claude Bright had been doing quiet reconnaissance for 2 months before Elijah returned to American soil. The reports were not good. Weston Transport, the freight and logistics company Elijah had built from a single truck depot in Beaumont, had laid off 340 drivers in 4 months. Garrison had outsourced the middle-tier routes to a cheaper competitor. The savings went directly into operational accounts that Garrison controlled personally. The drivers, many of whom had been with the company 15 years or more, received letters. No calls, no severance meetings. Letters. The 3 hotels were being stripped of their identities. The Dallas property, the Westin Grand, which Elijah had opened himself in 2009, which had a particular design philosophy he had argued about personally with the architect for 8 months, was being rebranded. Generic, cheaper finishes, higher margins. The farmland in Central Texas, 1,000 acres that Elijah had kept deliberately unprofitable because it employed 60 local families, and he believed in what it represented, was listed for commercial development. The Weston Foundation, which Viola had run with precision and genuine care, was effectively frozen. Garrison hadn't shut it down publicly. Too much press attention. But the operating budget had been quietly slashed by 80%. The scholarship program, which had been sending kids to college for 12 years, had processed exactly 0 new applications since the funeral. And the village. Elijah had grown up in a tight Beaumont neighborhood. Not a village in the geographic sense, but a community in every meaningful one. He had invested in that neighborhood consistently for 30 years. A rebuilt community center, a medical clinic, a small business fund that had helped 40 local entrepreneurs get started. All of it was being wound down. Garrison had decided those investments were non-strategic philanthropy. When Claude read Elijah that phrase over the phone, there was a long silence. Non-strategic philanthropy, Elijah repeated. Yes, sir. That's what he called it. That's the phrase in the memo. Another silence. Get me on a flight. Elijah Weston landed in Houston on a Tuesday morning in October. He went directly to a downtown hotel, not a Weston property, checked in as Edouard Diallo, and stood at the window of his room looking at the Houston skyline. His skyline. The Weston Energy Group tower was visible from where he stood, 42 floors. His name across the top in letters you could read from a mile away. He watched it for a while. Then he opened his laptop and got to work. The financial architecture of what Elijah built over the next 6 weeks would have impressed even his harshest critics. Through a Geneva-based holding company that Dewey, who turned out to have a remarkably sharp financial mind underneath the machine shop exterior, had helped establish, Elijah began acquiring shares. Not in Weston Energy directly, not yet. That would trigger alerts. He bought into 3 of Weston Energy's primary supply chain partners, then 2 of their major logistics contractors, then a minority stake in the commercial bank that held the largest portion of Weston Energy's operational credit line. He was building a web. quietly, patiently. From the outside, it looked like a wealthy foreign investor with eclectic portfolio interests. From the inside, Elijah was threading a noose. Prescott Hale was the first thread he pulled. Elijah had Claude identify every transaction Prescott had processed in the past 18 months. Not difficult, since Claude still had personal relationships with two people in the company's administrative department who had survived Garrison's purge and still, inexplicably, kept detailed records out of professional habit. What those records showed was breathtaking in its brazenness. Prescott had billed $4.2 million in legal fees against Weston Energy accounts in 8 months. For a firm his size, handling a transition of this complexity, $1 million was reasonable. Maybe 1.5, but $4.2 million meant Prescott was not just facilitating theft. He was also stealing. From Garrison. Elijah almost laughed when he saw the numbers. He had built an empire on reading people, and he had always known, somewhere underneath his trust in Prescott's competence, that the man had a particular weakness. He believed he was smarter than everyone around him. It was the kind of arrogance that made a person both useful and ultimately unreliable. Prescott was stealing from Garrison the same way Garrison was stealing from Elijah. It was theft all the way down. "They deserve each other," Dewey said when Elijah showed him the numbers. "They do," Elijah agreed, "but I'm not going to let them destroy each other quietly. I want it loud." Getting inside the mansion was Elijah's idea. Claude thought it was reckless. Dewey thought it was borderline insane. Adele, who had joined them in Houston because she had decided somewhere between Lion and the present moment that this story was worth seeing to its conclusion, said nothing, which was her way of expressing strong reservations. But Elijah was insistent. "I need to see it," he said simply. "I need to see what they've done to it." The mansion, Elijah's personal Houston residence, a 12-bedroom property in River Oaks that he had built in 2003, now employed a household staff that had been entirely replaced. Garrison had fired everyone Elijah had known personally and brought in a new crew through a staffing agency, which meant a vacancy. Garrison's current driver had quit abruptly 2 weeks earlier, apparently after Garrison threw a phone at him during a traffic delay, which tracks completely if you know Garrison, and the household manager had posted a replacement listing through the same agency. Elijah Weston applied. He was hired in 4 days. The first morning he drove Garrison Weston to the Weston Energy Tower, Elijah sat in the front seat of a $180,000 SUV that he had personally selected and paid for, driving a man who had forged his signature, stolen his empire, and announced his death. And he did not say one word. He watched Garrison in the rearview mirror. Garrison didn't look up from his phone once during the 20-minute drive. He was texting rapidly, occasionally exhaling with irritation, once saying incompetent loudly to no one in particular. He did not acknowledge the driver. Not a glance. Elijah thought about the 340 drivers he had laid off. He thought about Claude's box of belongings on the sidewalk. He thought about Dottie Reeves, Viola's assistant, crying on the phone. And he drove. The second week, Garrison was running late to a board meeting. He came down the front steps of the mansion moving fast, already angry, and found the car positioned 6 feet further from the door than he preferred. He stopped. "Do you know what time it is?" Elijah turned from the driver's seat. "I apologize, sir. I'll adjust." "Adjust nothing. Move the car. Right now. Every second you waste costs money." Elijah moved the car 6 feet forward. Garrison got in. Did not say another word for 20 minutes. The third week, the incident Claude had warned might happen and Elijah had dismissed, Garrison was coming out of a downtown restaurant after a lunch meeting that had apparently gone sideways. He was on a call that was not going well. He got into the car mid-sentence, still talking. Elijah pulled into traffic. An unexpected road closure added 7 minutes to the route. Garrison ended his call. "Why are we going this way?" There's a closure on Westheimer, sir. This route adds about... I didn't ask for an explanation. No, sir. A pause. Then Garrison's open hand struck the back of the headrest. Not quite Elijah's head, but close enough that it was clearly intended to land there. Drive faster, and don't explain things to me like I'm a child. Elijah Weston said nothing. He looked straight ahead. And somewhere behind those new eyes, in a mind that had built 40 years of empire from borrowed boots and $47, he filed that moment away with everything else. The grandson found him on a Thursday. Elijah had been walking through the mansion's east garden early in the morning, a habit that had been his for 30 years on this property, though the new staff didn't know that, when a voice came from behind the hedgerow. You're the new driver, right? Caden Weston appeared around the corner wearing a school hoodie and carrying a backpack, apparently cutting through the garden on his way to the car that would take him to school. That's right, Elijah said. The boy studied him with the particular directness that teenagers sometimes have, unfiltered, still unused to performing social niceties. You from here originally? No, I grew up in Texas, but I've spent time abroad. Cool. A pause. My grandfather built this house. I know. Caden looked at the garden, at the specific arrangement of oak trees that Elijah had planted himself, that he had chosen personally from a nursery in Katy 20 years ago. He used to walk out here every morning. Same time, same path. My grandma, his first wife before Rhonda, she planted the roses on that trellis. Elijah looked at the trellis. He had not looked directly at it since coming back. His first wife, Margaret, gone 11 years now. You knew him well? Elijah asked, keeping his voice steady. Yeah. Caden's jaw tightened slightly. Better than my dad did. My dad didn't. They weren't close. My grandfather and me, though, we used to watch old football games together on Sunday. He'd explain all this stuff about reading the field, the geometry of it. He was really smart. He sounds like it. I don't think he's dead, Caden said. Just like that. Flat. Direct. Elijah went very still. What makes you say that? Caden shrugged, the studied casualness of someone who has been told they're wrong too many times. Because nobody confirmed anything. I looked it up. The clinic had a fire, the records were messed up, and my dad announced everything way too fast. Way too fast. A pause. My aunt thinks so too. She just doesn't say it out loud. Elijah looked at this boy, this awkward, grieving, sharp 16-year-old, and felt something move in his chest that he had no name for. You're a smart kid, he said quietly. Caden looked at him. Something flickered in his eyes, a recognition that wasn't quite recognition. A sense of something familiar that he couldn't place. You walk like him, he said. Like who? My grandfather. A long beat. People say I walk like my father, Elijah said. Old habit. Caden stared at him for 3 more seconds. Then his phone buzzed, and the moment broke. I gotta get to school. See you around. He disappeared around the hedgerow. Elijah stood in the garden beside Margaret's roses for a long time afterward. He had been cross-referencing pharmacy records. A contact inside the company's private medical account had flagged an anomaly months before the surgery, something that had seemed minor at the time, but now looked different with context. A compound. A specific combination of 2 drugs, both legal individually, both available by prescription, both completely undetectable in standard blood work, unless you were specifically looking. Together, administered over a period of months, they produced symptoms indistinguishable from natural cognitive decline in a person of advanced age, fatigue, occasional disorientation, a drop in blood pressure that could over time put significant stress on cerebral blood vessels. Symptoms that would make a 70-year-old man appear to be declining. Symptoms that, and a man with a predisposition towards cerebrovascular issues, which Elijah had and which his family doctor had on record, could eventually trigger a hemorrhagic event. Elijah sat with this information for 48 hours before he said anything to anyone. He sat with the possibility that his collapse at that Atlanta podium, the blood on his notes, the fall, the chaos, was not entirely natural. That it had been assisted. When he finally told Dewey, Dewey put down his coffee cup very carefully and looked at the wall for a long time. "Who had access?" he said. "It wasn't a question." "Rhonda manages the household staff, including the kitchen, including anyone who handles my food or medication." "Prescott?" "Prescott would know what to get and where to get it. He has connections in pharmaceutical compliance from an old client case." "Do you have proof?" "Not yet." Dewey picked up his coffee cup. "Then get it. Here's the thing about people who build their lives on betrayal. They never stop. Because they can't. The same skill set that lets you betray someone, the calculation, the willingness to treat people as instruments, the constant scanning for personal advantage, that doesn't turn off when you've gotten what you wanted. It just finds new targets." Garrison had started to notice that Prescott's billing was off. He wasn't an accountant, but he was paranoid, another gift of the guilted conscience, and he had a forensic accountant named Bet Harlow, quietly reviewing the legal fees. Bet Harlow came back with numbers that made Garrison put his hand flat on the desk and breathe slowly through his nose. He confronted Prescott by phone. Prescott denied it. Garrison hired a second accountant. Rhonda, meanwhile, had discovered through her own surveillance. She had the household phones monitored, a habit she'd maintained since marrying Elijah, that Garrison was having her followed. He was building a case to remove her from the joint power of attorney. She took this information directly to Prescott, who was, of course, her co-conspirator and her lover, and now, apparently, a man who had been stealing from her current arrangement. The triangle began imploding. Rhonda hired her own lawyer, not Prescott, and started moving personal assets. Garrison found out and froze the accounts she tried to access. Prescott, realizing that both of them were now actively working against him, began preparing his own exit strategy. None of them noticed that every single one of these moves was being documented in real time, because none of them had thought to check who had acquired a significant stake in their primary banking partner 3 weeks ago, or who had quietly slipped detailed financial information to a journalist at the Houston Chronicle who specialized in corporate fraud, or who had sent anonymous envelopes to 3 members of the Western Energy Board, envelopes containing very clear photographs and very specific numbers. Mr. Diallo was an extremely busy man. The Western Energy Anniversary Gala was Garrison's idea. He'd been planning it for 2 months, a celebration of the company's 40th year, reframed as a celebration of his leadership and his vision. 1,200 guests, the Houston Grand Ballroom, politicians, business leaders, media, a keynote address that Prescott had helped him draft and that Garrison had memorized standing in front of his mirror. It was going to be his coronation. The invitations had gone out in gold foil. Edward Diallo received one. He RSVP'd, yes. The night before the gala, Elijah sat in his hotel room with Claude, Dewey, Adele, and Viola. Viola, who had been brought into the circle quietly 3 weeks earlier, in a meeting that had left her sitting, completely silent for 4 minutes before she pressed both hands over her mouth, and then said, in a voice that was barely a voice, "I knew it. I knew it." She was the one who had the most to contribute, as it turned out, because Viola had spent 6 months being overlooked and ignored, which meant she had spent 6 months watching. She had documented everything she could get her hands on. She had her own files, her own records, her own quiet conversations with former employees. She had been building toward something without knowing what she was building toward. Now she knew. The five of them sat around a hotel room table covered in documents and laptops and cold coffee, and they put the final pieces together. The evidence packet was comprehensive. The forged signatures, the pharmaceutical records, the financial transfers, Prescott's billing fraud, the offshore accounts, property transfer documents, a recording, obtained legally, of a phone call between Garrison and Prescott from 11 months ago, in which they discussed the old man's condition and timing in language that was not quite explicit, but was certainly enough to invite serious questions. At midnight, Elijah asked everyone to leave except Claude. The two of them sat there together for a while. "You don't have to do it tomorrow," Claude said. "You could do this through lawyers, through the courts, quietly." "I know. It would be less risky." "I know." A pause. "But you're not going to do it that way." "No?" Claude nodded slowly. "Because of the workers, the 340 drivers. Because of the drivers, because of the scholarships, because of every person who stood at my funeral and cried genuine tears while my family drank champagne." Elijah looked at his hands, those wide, strong workers' hands that 19 years of driving had not changed. "They need to see it, Claude. The people who believed in what I built. They need to see that it wasn't buried with me." Claude was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandson's going to be at that gala." "I know. That's going to be hard." "I know that too." Claude picked up his jacket, paused at the door. "For what it's worth, sir, I kept that box. Everything in it. Nothing missing." Elijah looked up. For the first time in a very long time, his eyes went wet. "Thank you, Claude. See you tomorrow." The Houston Grand Ballroom was extraordinary, on a good night. On this night, with 1,200 people in formal dress, a live orchestra, cascading floral arrangements that cost more than a reasonable car, and enough political and business power in one room to rearrange the city's skyline, it was genuinely breathtaking. Garrison Weston arrived at 7 p.m. in a custom suit and the easy confidence of a man who has forgotten what fear feels like. Rhonda arrived separately, in a car with Prescott, which anyone paying attention might have found notable. Caden arrived with his father, wearing a suit that was slightly too big for him, and immediately went looking for somewhere to stand that was not directly beside Garrison. Viola arrived alone, in a dark green dress, and accepted a glass of water from a passing server, and stood near the back of the room. She knew. She was the only person in that room who knew what was coming, and the effort of keeping her face neutral was the hardest thing she had done in 40 years. At 8:15, Garrison took the stage. The room settled. He spoke well. He'd always spoken well. It was genuinely his best skill. He spoke about vision and legacy, and the responsibility of stewardship, and the courage required to lead through difficulty. He invoked his father's name 3 times with practiced solemnity. He thanked the board, the investors, the extraordinary team at Weston Energy. He was 17 minutes in when a figure appeared at the edge of the stage, calm, elegant, moving with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly where they're going. Garrison saw him and frowned, a confused frown, the frown of a man who recognizes that something has gone wrong but hasn't yet identified what. "Mr. Diallo, this isn't—" But Edouard Diallo was already at the microphone. And the screens, the 4 massive screens arranged around the grand ballroom for the evening's presentations, were no longer showing the Weston Energy anniversary graphics. The room took 45 seconds to fully understand what it was seeing. The forged signatures, side by side with confirmed genuine examples, the differences annotated clearly. The pharmaceutical records, flagged by 2 independent forensic pharmacologists. The financial transfers, every account, every date, every amount. Prescott's billing fraud, Rhonda's offshore accounts, Garrison's gambling debts, and the connection to his motive. The phone recording. The silence in that ballroom was the kind that has physical weight. Then 1,200 people began talking simultaneously. Garrison moved fast, that much credit to him. He crossed the stage in 4 strides and grabbed the stranger by the arm, hard, turning him roughly. "Who are you? What is this?" The man in the elegant suit looked at him. And then he spoke. Not in the slight accent of Eduard Diallo. In a voice from Beaumont, Texas. In a voice that Garrison Weston had heard every day of his life for 44 years. "You know who I am, son." The hand on his arm went slack. In the front row, Rhonda stood up and sat back down. Prescott Hale moved toward the exit. He did not make it. There were 2 individuals near the door who had been waiting for exactly that movement. Garrison stared at the man on the stage. "That's not..." "Third oak tree in the East Garden. Your mother planted the roses on the trellis. You were afraid of that garden until you were 9 years old because of a story I told you about a fox." Garrison's face went completely white. "You fell off the fence at the Beaumont house when you were 6. Needed 4 stitches on your left knee. I carried you to the car." The room was absolutely silent now. "You asked me for $20 on your first date, and I gave you 40 and told you the extra was for flowers. You never bought flowers." "Stop." "And 3 weeks after my surgery, while I was unconscious in a hospital in Switzerland, you sat in my chair and signed my name to documents I never saw." Garrison Weston's face collapsed. It didn't harden. It didn't rage. It simply collapsed, the architectural failure of a face that has been holding a particular expression for so long that when the structure finally gives, it gives completely. "You're dead," he whispered. "You were wrong about that," Elijah said. "You've been wrong about a lot of things." It came from the left side of the room. A 16-year-old boy in a slightly too big suit, pushing through the crowd, moving fast. Caden stopped at the edge of the stage and looked up. He looked for a long time. The new face, the same hands, the same way of standing, weight slightly forward, like a man perpetually ready to work. The same eyes. "Grandpa?" It was barely a sound, a question so fragile it could have dissolved in the air. Elijah Weston looked at his grandson. And 70 years of composure, 50 years of building, 6 months of pain, 19 days of unconsciousness, 5 months of waiting, and a lifetime of being the strongest person in every room he walked into. All of it came undone at once. He stepped off the stage. He went to one knee. This old man, this reconstructed face, this king they couldn't wait to bury. And he put his arms around his grandson, and he held on. Caden held on harder. The room watched. Nobody said anything. The arrests began while Elijah was still holding his grandson. Houston PD, Corporate Fraud Division, coordinated with federal investigators who had been quietly briefed by Viola's legal team 3 days earlier. Garrison was taken out through the ballroom's east exit. Prescott was apprehended in the parking structure. Rhonda's assets had already been frozen an hour before the gala began. Her own exit strategy, the one she'd been preparing for 3 weeks, had hit a wall of paperwork she didn't know existed. The media was in that ballroom. By midnight, it was everywhere. The corporate unraveling took 6 weeks. The board, stripped of Garrison's installed members and faced with a comprehensive fraud case, voted to restore original ownership structure. 3 members resigned preemptively. 2 cooperated with investigators. 1, the one Garrison had simply paid, discovered that cooperation with investigators was a far better option than the alternative. Prescott Hale's legal career ended inside a month. The gambling debts that had started Garrison's desperation came to light during financial discovery. Terrence Quill, the man Garrison owed $1.9 million, turned out to have his own significant legal complications and was presently unavailable to collect. Rhonda, through a deal her new attorney negotiated, avoided the most serious charges in exchange for full testimony. She received what the prenuptial agreement entitled her to. Not nothing, but nowhere near what she'd been reaching for. Garrison stood in front of a judge 4 months later and said nothing worth remembering. Everyone expected Elijah to take it all back. Every share, every property, every title. The complete restoration of the Western Empire under Western control. He did something else. He took back what was legally the primary assets, the core holdings. Then he started making decisions that surprised everyone, including Dewey. 340 drivers were offered reinstatement with back pay. The Weston Foundation had its full operating budget restored, and then doubled. The scholarship program reopened with triple the previous annual capacity. The farmland in Central Texas was taken off the development market. The Beaumont neighborhood got its community center rebuilt, properly this time, with a proper endowment attached, so it wouldn't depend on personal generosity. Dottie Reeves got her job back. She cried again, the good kind. Claude Bright was offered his position back. He declined, gracefully. I think I'm ready to retire, sir, if you don't mind, and received a retirement package that made his daughter cry when she heard the number. The operational leadership of Western Energy was restructured around a new executive team, people Elijah had identified over the previous months, people who had demonstrated competence without corruption. None of them were family. Viola was offered the chairmanship of the board. She said she'd think about it. Then she said yes. 2 weeks after the gala, Elijah drove himself to Beaumont. Not in the $180,000 SUV. In a regular car, nothing notable. He parked on the street where he had grown up. He sat there for a few minutes. Then he walked. He walked past the rebuilt community center, past the medical clinic, past the church where his mother had taken him every Sunday until he was old enough to argue about it. He walked through the neighborhood slowly, the way you walk through something you know by touch. A few people recognized him, not because of his face, which was still new to everyone, but because of the way he moved, the way he stopped to talk, the way he listened. An older woman stopped him on the sidewalk. "You're Elijah Weston," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him carefully. "You look different." "Had some surgery." She considered this. "You okay?" And Elijah Weston, self-made billionaire, survived attempted murder, survived betrayal, survived a fake funeral, survived 6 months of rebuilding himself from the ground up, smiled. "Getting there," he said. She nodded, satisfied. "Good. We need you here." At sunset, he went to the cemetery. His mother's grave was simple, a flat stone. Her name, the years of her life, a small engraved cross. He had paid for the stone himself 30 years ago. He sat down on the grass beside it. He didn't have a prepared speech. He wasn't the kind of man who talked to graves, or hadn't been before this year. But something about the last 6 months had changed the architecture of what he was willing to feel in front of other people, or in front of stones. "I'm still here, Mama," he said. The sun finished going down. Somewhere behind him, in the neighborhood he had built and rebuilt, children were being called in for dinner. A dog was barking at something inconsequential. A car radio was playing something with a heavy bass line. The ordinary music of people living their lives. Elijah sat there until the stars came out. A week later. East Garden. Early. The oak trees were doing what they always did in October, holding on to their leaves a little past the point when they should let go. Elijah was halfway through his walk when he heard footsteps behind him. Caden, in a hoodie, backpack over one shoulder. "You're up early," Elijah said. "Couldn't sleep." The boy fell into step beside him. "Keeps happening." "It'll pass." "Grandpa." "Yeah." "I'm sorry I didn't figure it out sooner. I knew something was wrong. Hey!" Elijah stopped walking and turned to face him. You were 16 years old, and you figured out more than every adult in that building. Don't apologize for that. Caden looked at the ground for a moment, then up. What happens to Dad? A hard question, the hardest one. That's for the court to decide. And you? What do you want? What did he want? Elijah had asked himself this question at 3 a.m. in a Lion recovery room. He had asked it in the front seat of his own car, while his son's hand struck the headrest near his head. He had asked it sitting in front of his mother's grave in the dark. I want what I always wanted, he said. For the people who work for me to be treated with dignity. For the kids from this neighborhood to have a real shot. For the things I built to outlast me. Actually outlast me, not just outlast a fake death announcement. He put his hand on Caden's shoulder. And I want my grandson to build something of his own someday. Not inherit mine. Build his. Different industry, different city, different everything if he wants. But build something real. Caden was quiet for a moment. I want to be in renewable energy, he said. Elijah laughed. A real laugh. The sudden, genuine, slightly startled kind that you can't manufacture. Of course you do, he said. Come walk with me. They walked the rest of the path together, this old man and this boy, through the oak trees and past Margaret's roses, while the morning came in slow and golden over Houston. And for the first time in a year that had tried to kill him in every way available, Elijah Weston was simply alive. Nothing more complicated than that. Just alive.